Welcome to the Art Scene. I'm your host, Lila Snow. This episode features Carol Barsha, who has a show on the third floor at the American University Museum at the Katzen Center. It's up until March 15th. She does very powerful, large paintings. There are two other women, and their work focuses on the environment. But here's Carol to talk about her work.
Hi, I'm Carol Barsha. I'm an artist. I live in Montgomery County. We're here at the American University Art Museum at the Katzen Arts Center, where I am participating in an exhibition with two other women artists. This exhibit is called Landscape in an Eroded Field, and it pairs three women artists with quite different approaches to concepts of nature and really what human beings are doing right now in terms of what's happening with climate change. The other two artists, one is Artemis Herber, who's from Baltimore, and she works with large corrugated cardboard, and one of her paintings, one of her wall pieces really, not a painting, actually has industrial mops in it, but she tries to work with all found materials. Heather Teresa Clark used to live in Virginia. She's now in Vermont, and she's an installation artist. She has built a very large scaffold where you can take refuge, and the sound of water, music, and wind are the elements from nature that she wants you to hear. I have a more subtle approach to what I'm trying to say because I just am fascinated by the forms I see in nature, and I'm trying to build these compositions that are also beautiful. The other two artists' work is more three-dimensional, and I think seeing the three of us together makes for a very fascinating show. I spend a lot of time drawing, and drawing is the basis for these paintings. So all of these paintings are water-based materials, which I layer. It's very important to me to save the white of the paper as an essential element in the work. So where you see white, it's actually the paper, which means I have to build these compositions negatively. In other words, I always have to think about what has to remain, which gets complicated. In many of the more recent work, I actually use a razor blade and have to carve back areas that I've painted, taking the top layer of paint off to get back to the white paper. And some of these compositions are very highly worked into in that way. I also sometimes collage, where I add paper over to again get back to the white that I think is very, very important. But I layer using different kinds of inks. I use walnut ink, which is made from the black walnut tree. I use India ink, and then I also use watercolor gouache, pastel, charcoal pencil, and occasionally oil paint on top. I realized that in the summer I would go outside and I would do sort of casual studies with water media and drawing, and with just drawing materials. And I never actually respected that as much as the quote-unquote serious oil paintings I was doing in my studio during the rest of the year. And I think it just was a function of becoming a certain age and maturing and saying, to heck with it, this is what I want to do, and this is what I do better. And the work became much fresher and more original, and it's completely changed my life, really, and my success in the studio. I've basically been captivated by nature all of my life, and so to be doing this work that's inspired by what I see outdoors really culminates a lifetime of fascination for me. Over the last years, I've become very focused on the structure of flowers. I use them as a kind of reference point to build compositions. Also, birds have become very, very important to me. I think part of my fascination with birds is the sense that I'd like to see the angle at which a bird sees life. And so many of my recent paintings take the standpoint as if I'm down on the ground inside of a meadow or on the ground in the middle of a field with all kinds of elements that would be there. In my painting, The World is Too Much With Us, I actually have collaged chickens from my neighbor's garden that I use as elements to sort of have the viewer work their way through the space. And I create an imaginary space that they inhabit. I try to represent them, and also mostly nests, because I'm fascinated by the fact that they are their nests, but also that they build them, that they're so beautiful, that they're circular. In my most recent very large paintings, I'm fascinated by circles and spirals and the structures that they make, whether they're paired with the sense of a sense of distance. I'm trying to build a volume, a kind of an imaginary hill or a kind of a mound. This exhibit was curated by Laura Roulet, and it runs through March 15th. There'll be an artist talk on February 29th at 4 p.m., which the public is invited to.
Carol Barsha is having a show at her gallery, the Neptune Gallery, in April. Okay, on to, last time I talked about Duchamp, but that show is up until October, and I didn't say that much about it. It's really unusual to see 50 works by Duchamp, and last time I just showed a few images. So the webpage has more images, and it's really a special opportunity. On to the Academy Awards, and I'm going to put on my science hat here, because Little Women, with one of the sisters dying of scarlet fever, reminded me about childhood diseases and how scary that was. But first, I also thought of how many films and books and other things address having daughters and having to marry them off because there aren't many choices. So there's Fiddler on the Roof with having to marry off daughters just before the pogroms, before World War II.
At 3 I started Hebrew school, at 10 I learned a trade. I hear they picked a bride for me, I hope she's pretty.
And who does Mama teach? To mend and tend and fix, preparing her to marry whoever Papa picks.
There's Pride and Prejudice, where there are 5 Bennett sisters to be married off.
Handsome. He's single.
Happily so.
Oh my goodness! Everybody behave naturally.
Mr. Collins, at your service.
And Eligible is an update on that by Curtis Sittenfeld. And it's really amusing because with Jane Austen, you're considered sort of over the hill at 20. And in the update, Elizabeth is 40. And in the update, there's a transgender sister and a gay sister. So it's really interesting to see the way she addressed modern times with the update. Also, when you think of, well, Little Women addresses the Civil War period in the United States when the availability of husbands was really depleted by the war. So that's another thing. But earlier British books talk about how women died in childbirth, besides this problem of getting married off and turning your wealth over to your husband. They also had like 8 to 13 children, and half of them died. But my science hat comes on because the scarlet fever that Beth dies of in Little Women reminded me of how many decades there was such fear about polio, and then there was a race between Jonas Salk, the American, and Sabine, a Polish scientist, and the Europeans used his model. So there are two different ways with vaccines. You can take the live virus and diminish its strength, which is what Jonas Salk did, or you can build up antibodies by injecting the vaccine, and that's sort of a safer way to do it. So in 1962, living in Geneva, Switzerland, the Europeans used the Sabine model, and I remember taking my children to the pharmacy, and he put a drop of the Sabine vaccine on a lump of sugar. And because of the race, Salk, they were racing for the Nobel Prize, and neither of them ended up winning it. Neither of them won it, and in fact, the 3 scientists that did work that led to the vaccine won the physiology prize earlier than the Salk thing. So I just thought that was worth mentioning. But I also wanted to mention that Françoise Gillot was the last wife of Picasso, and she's the only one who left him. He always did the dumping, and she ended up marrying Jonas Salk. So I thought that was an interesting little sidelight. So I'll close with my mother's wise saying, if she saw somebody who looked very satisfied with himself, she would say, he's glad his mother had him, not a stranger. I want to thank my new assistant who researches facts, Justine Trottier, and I'll see you next time on the RCN. This is Lila Snow.